Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. This is episode 257 with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. And this week we're talking about the cars that were ahead of their time.
Mm-hmm.
I think we interpreted this one slightly differently.
Well, go on.
So I mean, not that it matters. To me, a car that was ahead of its time to its disservice, right? So it was a problem for that car. It arrived too soon.
Okay.
Before the market was ready, maybe before the technology was ready.
Yeah.
But that's just one interpretation. The other interpretation is that these are the sort of groundbreaking and pioneering cars.
Well, I don't think that those are in any way contradictory, are they?
They don't have to be.
I think there are lots of cars which we will go on to talk about, which failed.
Yeah. From a commercial point of view, yeah.
Yeah. It's like the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jetliner, which was a complete commercial failure, not least because a few fell out of the skies. But Boeing kind of learned the lessons from it, and 5 years after the Comet first came out, produced a thing called the 707, and completely transformed the future of global intercontinental travel.
So sometimes being best is sometimes being second is better, isn't it?
I think the point is that you can have the best car in the world, but if you don't launch it at a time that is right for that, you might as well have not made it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be a few examples of those as we go through this list.
Certainly some of mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I give you the Chrysler Turbine car.
Go on.
So Chrysler in the 70s launched this amazing looking thing that was built by, the bodies were built by Ghia maybe in Italy and shipped across.
I should know about this.
It
Was it a production car?
Well, sort of. They built a good number of them, and they were never sold officially to the public. I think they were sort of leased out to some people. And so for a while, in parts of the US, there were turbine-powered cars driving about.
So these were gas turbine cars?
Yeah.
The problem with a gas turbine is once you take your foot off the gas, it keeps spinning.
And you explained this to me before, which is why a gas turbine car has in the past been very competitive at Indy,
yeah,
where it's all about consistent speeds.
Yes, absolutely. But in Formula One,
it just doesn't
work.
work.
There was the latest 56B, I think.
Yeah, when you're accelerating and braking a lot, it just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work at all. And
it didn't work as a road car engine either. So that's an example of a proper flop. And I was thinking about this. One of the sort of characteristics of the kind of car that was ahead of its time to its detriment is that they are not replaced with a like-for-like model. And that is certainly true for some of the ones I've got here.
Yes.
But do you want to give us your first one to get started?
Have you got my list there?
I have. Do you want me to do
Yeah, can you fire them at me?
Number 1, Lancia Lambda.
Lancia Lambda. So the Lancia Lambda went into production in 1922. This was back in the day when you could put kind of anybody you liked on a car. But most of the ones that I've seen have been sort of open four-seat tourer. And it was the first production road car ever to have unitary body construction, which meant instead of having a body bolted onto a ladder like you get in a horse and cart, where the body itself has no structural component to it at all, the Lambda did. So its body, not just what was underneath it, but its body itself was the key to its strength. And the result of that was a car that was not just massively stronger and safer than a car that was sat on a ladder. It was also massively lighter too. And it was the first car that did that. It was also, I don't think it was quite the first car to have independent front suspension. Morgan might have beaten them to that, possibly. But it did, nevertheless, it had independent, what they call sliding pillar front suspension. So, this is back in the days when every car just had, they were so closely related to horse and carts. They still had leaf springs and they still had ladder chassis. And here was this Lancia just showing the way forward. And it was actually pretty successful. They kept on making it right through the 20s, I think into the early 30s as well. So there's a few of them knocking about.
It sounds a lot like the Citroën Traction Avant. Oh, that's on your list as well, number 8.
Except the Traction Avant was a monocoque.
Ah.
So I'm now going to try to explain the difference between a unitary body and a monocoque.
Yeah.
Not really helped by the fact that I'm not entirely sure myself. But basically, a monocoque uses the entire body. It doesn't use a frame like a sort of space frame or anything else. The entire body. So the skin of the car is structural to it. And actually, when most people refer to that car's a monocoque, what they actually mean it's a unitary construction. There are actually very few true monocoques outside the world of racing. Something like the Lotus 25 is a true monocoque because the actual skin of the car was structural. Whereas obviously with most cars, you have a structure to which you bolt panels. So that's the difference. So, but the traction at Avon was as I understand it, in 1934, I believe. Excuse me. Not only had independent front suspension, not only had a true monocoque, but it was also a front-wheel drive car.
Yeah.
Not the first front-wheel drive car. Alvis were making front-wheel drive racing cars, straight 8 supercharged racing cars in the 1920s.
Why?
Because they could. I don't know.
Blimey.
I don't know. But yes, the front-wheel drive Alvis was they did Le Mans and that sort of thing, and they did reasonably well. But they were very rare cars, and they never sort of the idea didn't cotton on then. But
Well, number 2 on your list is the Alvis Speed 20.
Yeah, first car with a fully synchromesh gearbox.
Oh, what year was that?
1933.
Wow. God, so it took a while.
If anybody has driven, particularly a big pre-war car, without any synchromesh on its gears, something like a Bentley or whatever, they are quite. There's nothing more likely to make you look like an idiot than a car like that.
Yeah, crashing away.
Because basically you have to time the speed of the engine to the speed it will be at once the next gear has been selected. Now, when you're on the way up, that's fairly easy because the engine, when your foot's on the clutch, the engine speed is naturally falling, so you just slot it in when you think you're somewhere near where it's going to be. But obviously on the way down, you're having to rev the engine. The engine has to, so you have to blip the throttle between your shifts. So you change into neutral, blip the throttle, then push the clutch down again. And you hope that your blip gets you somewhere near where the speed of the engine needs to be at to work with the lower ratio. And if you're out at all, well, if you're out a little bit, you just get these sort of slightly unpleasant noises. There can be a sort of a nasty clack but sometimes you can get some really horrible crunches and grinding noises. But if you get it really wrong, you get what we call a box full of neutrals, and it just won't take it. And you can find yourself, at which stage panic tends to set in. And you just think to yourself, okay, forget that gear, I'll try and get any gear. And there are just no gears left. And you literally end, believe me, we've all done it. People who drive pre-war cars, everybody who drives pre-war cars has done this, has ended up just literally stopping the car and selecting first and starting
again.
Yeah.
That puts the fear of God into me doing that, particularly on a busy road with other people around.
Now, I don't understand synchromesh. I don't understand how it works, but it's a way of making this problem go away. And it's very, excuse me, and it's very, very clever. And Alvis had a fully synchromesh box in its cars in the mid 1930s, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And I've driven them, and they're very heavy, and they're very slow changes, but the shift quality is beautiful. And I also understand they're just about indestructible. I think probably because they didn't really know what they were doing. They just thought, we better massively over-engineer everything.
Yeah.
So that was, but again, that was starting to cotton on towards the end of the 30s, and you'd often find cars with synchromesh on third and fourth gears. So you only had to sort of fiddle your way through first and second, and then you could get into third and into fourth, and then back to third. But the Alvis had synchromesh on every gear.
That is cool. So number 3 on your list, it's on my list as well. And this one sort of ties into what I was saying earlier. Definitely a commercial flop. Massively expensive for its manufacturer to produce, and therefore never repaid its investment. hasn't been directly replaced, which I think is another key giveaway.
Oh, I know where you're going now.
BMW i3.
Yeah.
And I think there is a new i3 coming, but essentially they're just using the badge, aren't they?
Yeah,
because
and it'll just be another EV.
It's going to be a very different kind of car.
Going back to what I said earlier, if ever you want an example of the right car being launched at the wrong time,
i3.
It was the i3.
How good would it be now? Particularly if it was...
It still is good.
Well,
I drove an i3 the other day.
Yeah. But, give it 10 years of battery technology advances.
Oh, for goodness.
It could be fantastic.
Goodness me, with a little Rex, just to make sure that you never actually had to, run out of juice.
Brilliant.
So, the thing people forget about the i3, because we always, you and I on this podcast on an almost weekly basis, lament just how heavy electric cars have got. When it went on sale, it was the lightest BMW on sale.
Yeah. 1,300 kilos or something.
Yeah, it was lighter than a 116i.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible.
So they don't have to be heavy.
And it had the CFRP, which is carbon fibre reinforced plastic construction. The money they must have spent.
Yeah.
But they were quick. They were fun because they were light. And they were available in 2 models, or they dropped the range extender one at some stage during its life. But yeah, I just thought it was a work of genius. I mean, and shout out too to the i8, which came out at the same time.
It's on my list.
A 2+2 sort of super GT powered by a 1.5 litre engine out of a Mini.
Brilliant car. I really like an i8.
Car.
I look at used ones from time to time. I'm not about to do it myself, but you can get them for 20-something thousand pounds.
Yeah, and again, carbon tub, plug-in hybrid, decent performance, lovely ride, a stunning looking car.
Yeah.
And people used to sort of say, "Oh, they don't oversteer." Well, it's just not the sort of, it's not what that kind of car is for. It's just for sort of going about your business, feeling good about yourself, seeing it there in the morning, and just getting into it with those sort of flip-up doors. And it was just a real. I was lucky. I had one for a year as a long-termer. And it's right up there. It's up there with my top 3 ever long-termers because and I've thought exactly the same thoughts as your thoughts as you, that when this business has had enough of me and I just want sort of one car to knock about in for the rest of my days, an i8 would be right up there.
They were also fun to drive because they had quite skinny tyres and not mega grippy tyres for the efficiency gains. And so you got into a real flow with them and you could feel it just ever so slightly skating across the road through a corner. And so it didn't have that overtired, lockdown, clamped kind of feel of a typical modern sports car. Yeah. And so it was really enjoyable because of it.
And you don't hear stories about them. There aren't sort of forums going on about, oh, you'd avoid this car because this, that and the other goes wrong with them. So I think BMW just over-engineered them.
Yeah.
But again, never replaced.
Yeah. Very cool car.
What's next?
Matra Simca Rancho.
Okay. So this is an example of another kind of car that was ahead of its time. It wasn't in any way technologically ahead of its time at all. It was just a kind of car which didn't really catch on until. So the Rancho was, if you looked at it, it's an SUV. Went into production in 1977, I think.
Yeah.
Lots of it's got quite a chunky appearance. It's obviously got a raised ride height. It looks very outdoorsy and off-roady and everything else. But it wasn't at all. It was just a bog standard front drive powertrain underneath it. And I can remember, at the time just thinking, well, that's just preposterous. That's just, a paper tiger. It's just pretending to be something it isn't. And now the world is just overflowing with it. And if anybody, had said, oh yeah, that's the way the world's going to go, I would have thought they were completely mad. Because here's a car which, looks a certain way and it doesn't even do what it looks like it's suggested. But yeah, so, I'm not saying in any way that I've never driven one, that a Rancho is a great car. I suspect it's probably not. But it did do something years before anybody else was in that space.
Yeah. As did the Tucker 48.
The Tucker 48. I've always called it the Tucker Torpedo. I only learned when I was researching this podcast that is a mistake. The prototype was called the Torpedo.
Right.
The car was called the 48, I presume, because it was built in 1948. Preston Tucker.
The whole story is fascinating.
The whole story, yes. And there's a fantastic film starring Jeff Bridges, whose name and the name of the film I've forgotten really, but maybe it's just called Tucker, I don't know, but it's about the life of this man. And it's very much a sort of Tucker-sided view of the man because, I'm sure if you asked the authorities who investigated Tucker and basically were responsible for the company's downfall, they would have taken another view. But anyway, he wanted to take on the big three because he thought that they were lazy and cavalier and not taking their responsibilities to their customers seriously. And so he came up with this concept. The idea actually was that this would be the safest car ever built. And it had all sorts of innovations on it. I mean, the prototype had disc brakes all around in 1948. It had that Cyclops eye at the front, which turned with the steering wheel.
Oh, did it?
Yeah.
Oh.
There was an enormous space under the dash where, in the event of an impact, your passenger could just dive into it. It was like a sort of safety cell in the footwell.
You'd have to have some presence of mind, wouldn't you?
It had an air-cooled flat six, rear-mounted flat six. Remind you of anything?
Yeah, a little bit like what is it called? A 911, is it?
Apparently so. It was just so far ahead of it. It was all-round independent suspension. It was so far ahead.
So why didn't it change the world?
The conspiracy theory is that the big three, so Ford, GM, and Chrysler, got together to kill it because they realised how far ahead he was, and then got the Securities Exchange Commission to investigate Tucker for all sorts of financial irregularities within the company. Certainly, the investigation took place, and I guess the sadness is that they were acquitted on all counts.
Okay. But the car was killed.
But by then the damage was done, and the company died. And there were 51 made. I think almost all of them survive, and they are worth millions.
Are they?
Today? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I looked up one which Bonham sold, I think, in 2019. And in 2019, so 6 years ago, it was a $2 million car.
Wow. Oh,
yeah.
Gosh.
Amazing looking thing.
Yeah.
I'd love to drive a Tucker.
There you go. If you own one. Here in the UK.
In the unlikely event you have a Tucker stuck in a shed somewhere in the UK, I'm on my way.
Give us a call.
Yeah.
Jensen FF.
Yeah.
So, am I right in thinking 2 key innovations here?
2?
Yeah. ABS and four-wheel drive.
ABS and four-wheel drive. In 1966.
Yeah. God,
people think of, Mercedes introduced ABS in the mid-1980s, and obviously the first high-performance four-wheel drive car was the Audi Quattro in 1980. Wrong.
Yeah.
It was a little British, sports car powered by a 6.3-litre Chrysler engine, which had both.
Yeah. Wow.
There's an amazing innovation. I think the four-wheel drive system was called, the ABS system was called the Matra system. So it was a mechanical system. So what it would do is it would detect when a wheel had locked and then would unlock it.
Probably fluid moving through valves or something, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It'd be something like that. So I think in the early days there was a Ford Fiesta that had 2-channel ABS. It only worked on the front wheels. I may be making this all up, but I don't think I am. And it was mechanical. And so I've never driven an FF, but I do remember the Fiesta. You could feel it because normally modern sophisticated ABS don't wait for the tyre to lock because if the tyre actually locks, you lose your steering. But they detect the pointed lock up and intervene then. Whereas with the Fiesta, certainly, the tyres would lock and skid and then unlock and then lock and skid.
So quite crude.
So very crude.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, probably an awful lot better than nothing. And the Jensen had this, nearly 60 years ago.
Yeah. I think that's cool.
It is cool.
Let's move through these. Chrysler Airflow.
Chrysler Airflow, 1930.
So this is about aerodynamic design, isn't
yes.
it?
So if you look at the cars from the 1930s, they've all been designed with upright radiators because that was the best way to get the air flowing through the car, and they have sort of separate wings and mud guards and freestanding lights and those sorts of things. And go and look at a Chrysler Airflow, and it had none of those things. It looks like a modern car. Everything is completely integrated into one seamlessly aerodynamic shape. It does look a bit odd.
Yeah.
And again, it was clearly ahead of its time because it wasn't a success. It stayed in production for a bit, but they never sold vast numbers of them. And now it's almost forgotten. I think it was pretty mundane under the skin as well. But, there in the 1930s was the first really proper serious crack at doing a Not a racing car, because there've been all sorts of aerodynamics developments on that side of things, but to do a proper family production car that was as aerodynamic as possible to make it as fuel efficient as possible.
So next on your list is the Citroën Traction Avant, which we've already spoken about.
Yes.
Number 9 then is the GM EV1. Now this was an electric car, a very, very a very early modern electric car. I don't even know if that makes sense. It was the latter part of the 1990s, and David Tuig, actually, our pet engineer, has written a story about the GM EV1.
And almost great.
And almost great, yeah. And so that is still up on the Intercooler app and website if you want to go and check it out. But this EV1 was General Motors' first crack at an electric car, fully battery electric car, in anything like the modern era. And it was, well, what do you know about it? I mean, it was clearly a flop. It never actually went anywhere. But I think they killed it themselves.
Well, I mean, it got incredibly expensive. So they made one massive mistake. They actually did sort of 2 generations of it. But the massive mistake they made with the first one was to fit it with a lead acid battery.
Yeah.
Which is the same sort of battery that people starts up the engine of the Ford Fiesta. Which meant the range was pathetic. I think the range of the original ones was something like sort of 50 or 60 miles. Quite an odd-looking car, but also massively expensive for them to develop. And there was a second-generation car which had a nickel metal hydride battery, but I think it just got, again, the idea was, outstanding and so prescient. If you think that it predated the Nissan Leaf, which is kind of regarded to be the first proper standard production EV, which I think came out in
08?
Yeah, exactly.
Around there.
Yeah, 09, I think. Predates that by years.
Yeah, more than a decade.
Yeah.
So originally it was only leased in LA. There weren't many of them, and apparently people within, the grown-ups within GM, the sort of accounting department, got cold feet about supplying spares and warranty claims, which are very, very costly. And so they just spiked the whole thing. They bought the cars back, crushed them.
Yes, there are very, very few left, aren't there?
Yeah.
Tiny number have survived.
And the ex-GM R&D boss, Larry Burns, has gone on record to say, if we could turn back the hands of time, we could have had the Chevy Volt 10 years earlier.
Maybe the world would have been, but then 10 years earlier, that would have probably been the wrong time too, isn't it?
Yeah, it probably would have
been.
Maybe. So while we're on the subject of EVs, what about the Tesla? I don't know if we talk about the Roadster, the original Roadster, or the Model S.
I'd be more interested in talking about the Model S, because the Tesla Roadster was a roadster to nowhere, pun intended, because it never resulted in anything, did it? And they made a tiny number, and they were derived from the Lotus Elise, and the most famous thing that ever happened to a Tesla Roadster was one of them got fired into space. But the Model S was, that was a real wake-up call for the global industry. And so much of what Tesla went on to achieve was built on the back of the success of the Model S, which when it came out was unlike any other car. Now, this is an example of one which really worked. They're still making it. What is it, 10 years later?
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
And if you look at it, actually, to me, they don't look dated. And it was just a completely new way of not just doing EVs, but the way the cars operated. They were youthful, and they were fresh, and they were interesting, and you could see why they caught on. It was an extraordinary endeavour to bring that car to market. And yeah, although, goodness me, I have some reservations about. I'm about to say the founder of the company. He wasn't the founder of the company, but the man whose name has become synonymous with the company. But that first car was an absolute landmark in car design. Whether you're interested in EVs or not, you can't deny the fact that Tesla Model S is where basically the whole mass production EV family car.
Yeah, the more upmarket thing. Yeah, and it's the car that the established legacy car makers seemed to have no interest in building at that time. Little electric cars, they were happening, but not sort of executive ones.
No, and that's exactly the point. It was the fact that Tesla caught the whole world on the hop, and they basically had that field to themselves. They were the only act in town, which is another reason. Well, it's probably the main reason the car was so successful. And then things like the Jaguar I-Pace came along, which was a much better car than the Model S, a much more desirable car than the Model S. But by that stage, Tesla was up and running and just had, much the same way that, when Toyota did the Prius in 1999, the original Prius was not a very nice car, but they just occupied the hybrid spot and just owned that part of the field, and so and were able to exploit it in a way that, the others, when they came along, just looked like sort of, me too, please cars. Not the sort of the originators or the inventors. And so fair play to Tesla. I think that, the Model S is an absolute landmark car.
And they also built out the charge network, didn't they? The supercharger network.
And that was so important.
So important. Let's talk about some sexier stuff.
Oh, go on then.
Right. Let's do Mercedes-Benz 300 SL.
The Gullwing.
Yeah.
1954.
So why was this ahead of its time?
Technologically, there was nothing really on it which hadn't been on cars before. It was just cleverer in the way that it had been constructed. It was unbelievably aerodynamic. It was beautiful. It took road car performance to a new level. In the mid-1950s, I'm just trying to think what the fast cars back then would have been. Sort of, an Aston Martin DB24 might have had 140 horsepower, something like that.
Wow.
Jaguar XK 120, 140 probably would have had about that. This had 220 horsepower. And because it was incredibly aerodynamic, it probably would get quite close to 150 miles an hour, which, 70 years ago, which is what we're talking about, was unprecedented. It looked incredible. It had those gull-wing doors. It was just unbelievably desirable. It is the car, and it's always an argument, isn't it? What's the world's first supercar?
Yeah.
But I think that is it. I don't think it's the Lamborghini Miura, because this is the car that established a new. It was almost, I wouldn't go this far, but it was almost the McLaren F1 of its day, in terms of its ability to, to do things that road cars had never done before. It was deficient in its brakes. It had drum brakes, really should have had discs. The brakes just weren't good enough. And it had that very disconcerting swing axle rear suspension. So, much more than an early 911, it was a car where you had to have the power on. If you found yourself cornering a bit too hard and needing to lose speed, then you could get yourself into a world of pain with them.
Ooh.
Because the rear suspension geometry would essentially narrow the rear track of the car, and also take the main contact patch of the tyre away from the tyre, and then you could be over the hills and far away.
Oh, God.
So if in doubt, get your clog down. But nevertheless, a gorgeous car. And also, I've done the Mille Miglia retrospective in a couple of them, and you're driving these cars, and you actually feel like a fraud in them, because it's meant to be this event for old crocs, and it's meant to be, difficult and tiring and a real battle, man against machine.
But it's actually quite a nice place to be.
You're sitting there thinking, I could be in a modern car.
Yeah.
It's just too easy. They were that far ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing things.
Porsche 959.
Porsche 959.
I have driven one, actually.
Well, go on. Why don't you talk about the 959?
Ooh, okay. I might need your help. But the one I drove was actually a sort of pre-production prototype thing. And so I called it a decontented 959 because it had a load of stuff that it didn't have, a load of stuff that production 959s did have. Things like, did they have switchable dampers? And I can't remember the details, but there's a bunch of clever tech that the production cars did have and this one didn't.
Yes.
But even so, it was a 959. It had four-wheel drive. It had the twin-turbo engine. And it was fantastic. And it was so fast. But actually quite easy to drive fast too. And it looked super cool in that sort of 1980s futuristic way of the 959.
6-speed gearbox?
I think so.
Yeah. I think it might have been the first road car with a 6-speed gearbox.
Yeah. I can't remember exactly, but Honestly, it was so cool.
You could do clever things with their diffs.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a sort of a dial switch down there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sequentially turbocharged engine.
Yeah.
One little turbo followed by, which gradually gave over to one big turbo. So you got all the response of a little turbo low down and then all the punch of a big one high up. I mean, I don't know why manufacturers don't still do that.
I think they probably feel that modern turbos are now responsive enough.
Yeah.
That they don't need to. But, I mean, it's a clever way of doing it. And do you remember late last year, there was a series of Ferrari F40 crashes doing the rounds online. And I was just thinking, if they were in a 959...
They wouldn't have crashed.
It would never happen.
No.
It's a much more sure-footed car.
First four-wheel drive super stroke hypercar? Yeah, would have been. Yeah.
So very, very clever
many
car.
first. Very, very clever. A real technological showcase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great car. Okay. Oldsmobile Jetfire / Chevrolet Corvair Monza. Are we talking turbo?
We are talking turbo. Yeah. So this was absolutely cars that failed because they had the right idea but the wrong execution, done at the wrong time. So in the mid-1970s, 3 turbocharged cars came along. There was the Saab 99 Turbo, the BMW 2002 Turbo, and the first 911 turbos. And certainly the Porsche and the BMW sort of vied with each other for being the world's first production turbocharged car. Neither is true. The Oldsmobile Jetfire and the Chevrolet Corvair Monza in 1962 had a Garrett turbocharger on their engines. And
what? Hang on. So Garrett was making turbochargers at this point. What were they used for? Do you know?
I think I don't know. They must have been used for. I mean, okay. I know that, for instance, pole position at Indy in 1952 was achieved by a Cummins turbo diesel car. So they put these, and they got a lot more power and they got a lot more torque. But they were very expensive, and the warranty claims, because they weren't that reliable, were considerable, and all the usual problems that you would expect with turbocharged engines. So one of the problems with a turbocharged engine, what it effectively does, if you turbocharge an engine, it effectively raises the compression ratio. So you have to lower the compression ratio of the car, and that's why you get turbo lag, because when the engine's not boosting, you're basically in a low compression car, which doesn't give you much bang for your buck, and then the turbos kick in and then off you go. I think with these things, they probably didn't lower the compression ratio, which meant they got all sorts of issues with reliability and knock and that sort of thing. And people had enough of it. But the theory was absolutely right. I mean, they were powerful and they were fast for their era. I mean, not by modern standards. You drove it now, you'd probably be a bit shocked by how slow these cars were. But they were doing it. But basically, they killed off turbocharging for another decade or more. Yeah.
Someone who should know about these things once told me that if you have a turbo, from a cooling point of view, you basically have to assume you've got 2 engines.
Well, because you've got to cool the engine and you've got to cool the turbo.
Yeah. And the cooling demands of a turbo are so great that you need essentially the same cooling apparatus that you would need for an entire engine.
Gosh.
So that causes big problems. Honda Insight.
Yeah. Actually predated the Toyota Prius as a production hybrid. And to me, just so much nicer than a Prius. Because, whereas the original Prius was just a sort of jelly mold blob of a car, Insight's a really good-looking car. A Honda Insight is desirable. And to me, it's just Honda sort of got the fact that people wouldn't just buy it because it was a hybrid. They had, it had to have something else. And so they made this great-looking little coupe, which was actually pretty good to drive. I think Autocar had a long-termer for a bit, which I used to knock about in all those years ago. But it just never took off.
Yeah,
I guess because it was coupe, because it was impractical, and I know it was expensive, and very few were made. But I think Johnny Smith has one, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
Which has done a huge mileage.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those cars that I just look back on very fondly, and kind of wish that so many of the hybrids that then came along had been developed in its image. But I understand why they weren't, because it wasn't a success. So why would you go down that path too?
So one that wasn't on your list, but I did want to bring it up,
Yeah.
and you'll have some thoughts on this, is the Audi A2.
Yeah.
So very, very small compact car, but aluminium construction,
Yeah.
which made it light
Mm-hmm.
and therefore more efficient.
Yes.
But that is an expensive way to build a small compact car, isn't it?
I mean, it was a bit nuts.
Yeah.
Because aluminium is expensive, and it's not very easy to make in large numbers, which is why manufacturers who have expensive cars, which they don't build in very large numbers, are very keen on it. You know, McLaren their bodies made of aluminium. Ferraris have their bodies and their chassis made of aluminium. So what you really, really don't want to do. So these are low volume, high margin cars. Suit aluminium.
Yeah, fine.
So you don't want to be doing it with a high volume, low margin car like a family hatchback.
Yeah.
And that's what Audi at the sort of peak of the sort of wonderfully mad Piech era, we just thought we'll just try anything. And that's what you got. I really want an A2.
Yeah. Well, that's another example of, as I was saying earlier, cars that were not directly replaced like for like.
Well, no, because Audi would have lost an enormous amount of money on it. They didn't sell very many because they were expensive and looked odd, and didn't have much rear headroom from memory. And they thought better of it, but really glad that it was out there.
Yeah. All right. So the last one that's on your list, and the last one that we're going to talk about this week, is the Lohner-Porsche. And I don't know what that is. So if I had to guess,
a Lohner-Porsche is.
If I had to guess, I would say, and I know it's not this because you have told me what it is, but before that, I would have said it was a one-off Le Mans car with a Porsche engine or using a Porsche as a platform.
Yes.
That's what I'd guess.
Like a Courage Porsche.
Yeah, something like that.
No, it's not that.
Okay.
No, it's not that. So the Lohner-Porsche, I mean, it was the first car. I think it did bear the name Porsche, but it was certainly the first car to be known as an anything Porsche. And it was the work of Ferdinand Porsche, the man who founded the company, Ferry Porsche's father. And the first ones were built in 1900.
Wow.
So 125 years ago.
Yes.
And what is so extraordinary about this car, given that it came along 14 years after the very first car ever ran, at a time when cars were still dangerous, slow, smelly, unreliable contraptions. It was a petrol-electric hybrid with four-wheel drive in 1900, and it still blows my mind.
That is amazing.
Yes.
Petrol-electric hybrid with four-wheel drive in 1900.
Yes, and it had in-wheel motors. Yeah. So
wow.
Originally, it was going to be an EV.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, he did do some EV versions of it, which were also, it was also front-wheel drive. So it's probably the world's first front-wheel drive car as well.
Yeah.
And then you'll be amazed by this, but customers didn't really like the range, which probably would have been about 10 miles. So Ferdinand thought, I know what, we'll stick a petrol engine on it as well. And then we'll have a petrol engine which can, help out with the electric engine. And then it became four-wheel drive. And then you get what you get. So there is one, Porsche have one, which I've driven in Stuttgart. They had to go somewhere. We had to go somewhere private, not on a public road. I don't know whether it was a licensing issue or whatever, but this is one of the most primitive-looking things you've ever sat in, or in fact, in this case, on.
Is it an open-top thing?
Yep. Open-top thing, big, tall, unwieldy, ungainly, not particularly pretty, incredibly slow. Quite difficult to drive. Quite difficult to drive. I should have gone back and looked up my notes. It was a while ago that I drove it. But what I do remember was it was quite a performance to get the thing moving. And once it was moving, I think one of the reasons that we had to go somewhere private with a lot of space is it was almost impossible to stop.
Really?
It just kind of kept going.
That was the problem.
Yeah.
Blimey.
But, if you look at the innovations on that car, petrol electric four-wheel drive hybrid with in-wheel motors.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
What does that tell us? I mean, it shows someone who is thinking very differently to the sort of received way of doing things, accepted way of doing things. I mean, that is
So someone who simply didn't accept the fact that it had never been done before with any kind of reason not to do it now.
Yeah, which is absolutely at the heart of progress within any kind of engineering realm, isn't it?
It is.
That is amazing. All right. Well, we've exhausted your list. We've exhausted my list. But that was good fun. We'll leave that one there.
Okay.
So all there is time left for me to do now is to remind you all, please. To follow the show. Whether you're listening via a podcast app, just follow the show, or you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. It really, really helps us. You are doing it, but keep doing it if you haven't already. And in return, we'll be back again next week.
See you then.